Canada, Mike, the loss of small, shallow wetlands and cropland is at 0.88% a year.
Wow.
Giving presentations and talking about this. And listen, if your financial advisor was returning you 0.88% a year, you'd fire him or her pretty quickly. It doesn't seem like a lot.
No, but just think about, do the math on that. It's not 1%. So it's not over 50 years you're going to lose 50% of that wetland type, right?
Right.
But it's pretty substantial.
1% than it is to 0%.
Exactly.
Right?
It's pretty rough. Yeah.
Yeah. And you think of the historic rate of wetland loss in the Canadian prairies, it's been profound. And then you amplify that and say, let's say you and I continue to do, make better lifestyle choices. We live for 30 years. At that rate, we're going to have 25% fewer wetlands than we do today.
You are tuned in to the FowlWeather Podcast, the forecast to your next successful hunt. Coming to you from the home office, Jacks Reef, New York.
Hold on, folks. Don't turn that channel. We've got some really exciting news for you. The FowlWeather Podcast has teamed up with Wildlife Strategies. That's right. I'm now working directly with Ryan Delaney of Wildlife Strategies to build value into your land. Wildlife Strategies is already known for quality wildlife habitat management, be it deer, turkeys, ducks, or whatever you pursue. Ryan knows his stuff. Look, I don't add my name to just any business, but I believe in what Wildlife Strategies is doing for landowners throughout the Southeast U.S. and beyond. If you want science-based solutions to create great wildlife habitat, Wildlife Strategies is your best bet. If you're interested in ducks, when we say, may your skies be filled, well, Wildlife Strategies does just that. They fill your skies with ducks. Contact Ryan Delaney today at ryan@farmlg.com for a site visit. You won't be disappointed you did. Ryan covers the southern tier of states, and I'm available to build habitat management plans across the northern tier. Contact us today for a quote. The Wildlife Strategies team sees your property through from the initial assessment and development of a 3-year time frame management plan through annual check-ins and course corrections as needed. Contact Ryan today at ryan@farmlg.com or Dr. Mike at FowlWeather.co. You won't be disappointed you did. Fill your skies with ducks and your forests and fields with deer and turkey with Wildlife Strategies. Hey folks, welcome back to the FowlWeather Podcast. If you follow information about ducks at all, you've probably already heard John Devney's name, right? Delta Waterfowl's John Devney. Naturally gifted with the capacity to hold an engaging conversation for sure. John is Delta's main man on Capitol Hill and regularly has an active seat on a lot of committees, councils, and working groups while providing that voice for hunters and the ducks that those hunters pursue. So welcome, John, to the podcast. Really appreciate you being here. And you are Chief Policy Officer for Delta Waterfowl Foundation, correct?
Yeah, Chief Policy, they only give me one title and one business card. So Chief Policy Officers, what we're running with for today.
So we had, a few weeks ago, we had Frank Baldwin on. And in this episode, we're actually going to chat a lot about Canadian policy and wetland conservation in Canada that Delta Waterfowl kind of drives. But maybe we start talking about, at first, I want a little bit of your resume, John, because it is impressive, and you and I work together a bit as well. But I'd like you to not be humble for like 2 seconds and let it roll here.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is what happens when you've been around for a long time, right? As sooner or later you get tapped to do all this stuff. So I serve as Delta's representative on the Prairie Pothole Joint Venture, which is one of the original joint ventures, great partnership of folks doing good work for ducks here in the U.S. Prairie Pothole region. I also chair the PPJV's policy committee, which is a relatively new endeavor. I mean, the PPJV has been involved in policy, but this sort of formalizes it a little bit. I'm currently serving as chair of the Hunting and Wildlife Conservation Council, which is serving at the pleasure of the Secretary of Interior and the Secretary of Agriculture, advising the administration on conservation and hunting policy. That's my second tour of duty on that FACA council. I was lucky enough to be part of the previous iteration of that during the Trump administration too, and chaired the hunting committee there. Also serving as vice chair of the American Wildlife Conservation Partnership, which is a consortium of 50 some organizations that work primarily on federal policy. So many, Ducks Unlimited, Pheasants Forever, the Rocky Mountain Elks, NWTFs, Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation, and all of those organizations all around the country are coming together to speak on one voice on conservation and sportsmen's issues. So, I think for me, Mike, obviously it's an honor to be selected by the secretaries to serve on the council. Appreciate being elected as vice chair and next year's chair AWCP. But listen, there's only so much room on a guy's wall for certificates. I think what it really gives me the opportunity to do is just sort of amplify Delta and duck hunters' voice in some of these important policy forums. And so it's, for a guy that just wanted to shoot ducks his whole life, it's pretty cool having these opportunities.
So I want to tell you, we're not that much different, because the reason the FowlWeather Podcast even exists is because I used to go all these days, and the listeners that are like dedicated listeners know this. I used to just go when I had time. And now as my life has gotten busier, it was kind of like this thing that I wanted to figure out, like, what are my best days to go and hunt, right? And so all of this kind of happened because I just wanted to shoot ducks, but I also wanted to be more efficient at it. And so as the science nerd that I am, I'm like, there's got to be an equation for this. And turns out it works. So this just led me down that road. And because your background isn't wildlife at all.
No.
Mine's forestry. And then I just got like the duck hunting bug and decided, hey, this is what I'm going to do. Right. And even without a wildlife degree as an undergrad, it just took off. So your background's quite varied too.
Yeah, and that's sort of the real treasure being, coming to work for Delta when I did in the late 1990s, and then really studying at the knee and being around a lot of brilliant waterfowl scientists. I think it's probably helped me, Mike, in my career, because a lot of people in our field can sort of take the science for granted, and I've always had a bit of a chip on my shoulder because I wasn't a technically trained biologist, and I don't have a master's degree or a PhD in waterfowl science, and so it's caused me to really crave to learn as much as I possibly can about the subject. And I'm a guy that still reads journals and still reads articles when they come out, and so I think that that desire to learn and desire to be able to make the connections in a public policy sense to the biology, to translate that into public policy, is something that I've certainly prioritized in my career. And I think it's, it's great to be able to learn from so many great people that I've had the pleasure to be around over my career, right?
Well, and that's where I'm at, is like, I don't feel like there's a problem being an armchair bird nerd. Because when I talk to you, you've picked all this stuff up as well. And that's where I think a lot of duck hunters tend to go, is they go down that rabbit hole, right, too. And they just want to know everything about the animal they pursue. And you've done that very well. And you've also really linked it closely with policy and brought duck hunters' interests forward, using science as a basis, but also understanding that duck hunters kind of drive, waterfowl conservation that is on this continent now. And just take a second and hit on that, that Delta thread of who you are. And I guess most listeners will be accustomed to who Delta is and Delta Waterfowl Foundation's name, but maybe hit on that and how y'all really help, keep ducks on the landscape and really focus on duck hunters. Give us a little taste of that.
Yeah. I came I came to Delta at sort of an interesting inflection point, right? Because, I came on at Delta in November of 1998, where Delta was sort of going through this, was sort of wrestling with who it wanted to be when it grew up, frankly. And which is kind of hysterical because the organization was almost 100 years old at that point, right? But I think there was this sort of growing realization around that time period that the sort of traditional Delta model of doing really great peer-reviewed science and having it translate into outcomes maybe wasn't working as well as it could, or maybe there was a way to do things a little bit different. And so, obviously Delta has this incredible legacy of supporting great graduate work and training, generations of and legions of talented waterfowl scientists and waterfowl leaders. But, little things like, that we watched happen in the late 1990s and the early 2000s with the consequences of having really good agricultural policy in the US and not so much in Prairie Canada, and how that resulted in a fairly, I'll say seismic shift in duck distribution from what was happening in the 50s, 60s, and 70s to what's happening today. The work around intensive management, especially when I came on at Delta, was pretty intense and pretty hot. But I think there's a real role out there for utilizing predator management in hen houses to increase duck production in those landscapes were, frankly, probably pretty good agricultural landscapes where we're lucky enough through Fish and Wildlife Service or, DU or somebody else to have wetlands on that landscape. Those landscapes could use another tool to increase production. The other thing about it is, I don't think the founding fathers at Delta worried about the decline of duck hunting the way we have to today.
Certainly.
I think, we've watched duck hunter numbers decline by over 70% in Canada, 30% in the US. There's barriers to access. There's all these things that are tied up in duck hunting. I think that was another inflection point right after I came on board as we amended the mission statement, not just to talk about waterfowl, but to talk about waterfowl hunting as well. So, again, I guess kind of right place, right time. It's been pretty incredible going on 26-year adventure here. So,
and if you've listened to the podcast yourself and our dedicated listeners will know this, I beat the drum all the time that, you do have a voice as a hunter, and that, the folks out there with state, federal agencies are really kind of on the hook as a little bit of they're public servants. And so I'm like, look, if you see something going sideways, like, you have a voice, and Delta has helped to be a megaphone of that voice. And that's important. And I've always, like, when Delta branded itself the Duck Hunters Organization, I went, brilliant, done. You guys are all in, and you're gonna hit on all cylinders for a long time, because it was a missing niche that was definitely needed. And you're still doing science. You're the policy, lots of science, and we'll get into that later on, and what you've contributed to science about harvest management. You're focused on wetland policy. You're focused on youth recruitment. You're focused on college students getting into this as not just biology students and wildlife students, but those wildlife students that also hunt, or at least have an understanding of it.
Yep.
So, like, the fingers in Delta now are in all the places that no other nonprofit tends to be as heavy as you are. And that's what I love about what you've done.
Well, and I think when you get a call from a duck hunter that just lost opportunity through something as silly as a discharge ordinance to a marsh they love to hunt, or they might have shot their first duck there with their dad or grandfather, or it's the closest place for them to hunt. And those are real world examples of real human beings struggling with these sorts of issues. not to mention Sunday hunting, not to mention pintail and scaup bag limits and all the rest of that stuff. But, I think some of my most gratifying times at Delta have been, helping a handful of human beings preserve opportunity and access to a place that they treasure hunting, because we've all had it happen to us, a place that we love to shoot that we can't shoot anymore. And so, I think that sort of work, I think there's an important role there. I think it's a uniquely sort of Delta space, and we're certainly glad to be there working with duck hunters every day on those sorts of issues.
Yeah, and I think we all appreciate you all being there. So, there's shade thrown at just about every single nonprofit, but I don't. I did an episode on why everybody should be a member of Delta a while back, and I feel that, right? Like the conservation table is kind of a big place, and there's too many people out there, John, and you know this, that don't want us to be doing what we're doing at all, to even think about being infighting. And that's where I like all these wetland, and duck hunting and just hunting conservation organizations finding their space and filling it and helping, at the larger scale. So let's jump on local conditions, and then we're going to get into Canadian policies and how you all have been involved in conserving wetlands on the Canadian prairies, because we did hear from Julia Peebles with Ducks Unlimited on the Farm Bill, and we can make a comparison between Farm Bill and Canadian stuff for sure. Yep. But let's first a little bit about conditions in North Dakota, because we heard from Sam Kushia in northeast South Dakota about conditions there. And then we heard from Frank Baldwin. Rain seemed to come pretty late, but they got good wetland conditions for ducklings now. I do want to say, though, like, we're going to be about a month out by the time this gets aired, but the flooding in South Dakota, Iowa, and Minnesota is pretty catastrophic for people right now. So I don't want to skip over that. That's serious for farmers. It's serious for people's livelihoods and their lives, right? There's actually been
pretty destructive flooding.
Pretty substantial stuff. So I don't want to downplay that at all. The flip side of that, of always with this, is that these conditions in some places are probably going to help ducks, right, over the long term. Maybe not right away this year, but what are y'all seeing in North Dakota? I'm guessing all your crops are in, but there's a lot of water sitting on the land at this point, or you're a little drier.
Yeah, we're a little bit drier. It's interesting, Mike. I mean, we had, as you reported through last winter, we had no winter here. Right. I always gauge the severity of winter, or how long I can wear my Crocs back and forth out to my shop. And this winter, it was almost all winter long. In contrast with last winter, where we had, 105 inches of snow in brutal cold temperatures. So, but I felt like we went into winter in pretty good shape. I thought moisture conditions were pretty good. But my first sort of slap in the face with it was driving across North Dakota the Tuesday after Easter. So late April or early April, I guess. And I was really startled how dry it was. Mm-hmm. If you drive from east to west across North Dakota, you spend the first, hour-ish in the Red River Valley, where the wetland density, historically there were high density of wetlands are all gone. And I thought, well, when we come out of Valley City and we get up and get in the drift plain, we'll start to see wetlands again. And I kept looking and looking and looking and looking. And I'm like, no temporaries, no ephemerals, no temporaries, and the seasonals were dry. And I thought, oh my goodness. And it just stayed that way the whole way across the state. And I just thought, I had just been being incredibly hopeful, but it was so bloody dry early. And then we just sort of flipped the switch. And we've been in this situation a few times over the last 10, 15 years, where we started dry, and then all of a sudden the rains start and conditions look pretty good. I guarantee you that if you went out today, wetland conditions today are better than they would have been when either Mike and the North Dakota Game and Fish did their survey work, or even when the feds did theirs. We've just had nice timely rains. You and I talked about before we got on here, probably a little too late in terms of influencing the distribution of breeding ducks, but it should mean good re-nesting, good duckling survival, especially if we can sustain this here for a few more weeks.
Yeah, so I think production coming out of this would be good. We'll send these ducks south, and then what I'm really hoping for is this transition from El Nino to La Nina. We've been talking about it. It should be wetter. It should produce more snow for the coming year. That's my thing. I really think, I've said this on like 4 episodes now. Like, I think I can forecast next winter's weather already, but I'm not going to do it yet. Right. I'm going to delay that till like at least early October, late September for the first long-term forecast. But there's some indications of where we're headed with this winter, and it has to be better than last year. There's no doubt. And if that doesn't happen, then equatorial heating has got us completely buggered up, and we're in a world of hurt for long term. But I don't think that's it. I think we're still seeing cycles. I think we're still in a good spot, and that we're going to get a colder, wetter winter for y'all. And that would be like, a February, late January, February, March, like those big blizzards that do happen. They can be catastrophic too. I was out there in 1998, and you were probably in that part of the world around that time.
Yep.
It was, there were dead cattle in fields and things.
Yep.
And that's when, like, once one lake flooded into another, and they've now become one lake and they've never gone back. Right. At least in some parts of the world. And so those things can be problematic too, but the potential for them to produce real duck habitat is great. So my sense is if we get really good production this year, especially on the re-nest, and then a lot of duckling survival, birds that grow nice and strong go south, we're going to send a nice bunch of birds back to some pretty good conditions, hopefully next year. And so a little perspective on how quickly does that stuff come back, John, when it happens? You've seen the lows and you've seen them come back too. Does it, it takes a few years, right?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think if the water is here early enough, this is the thing, I don't know how much you and I have talked about it. This is a whole, thing that's sort of the great unsaid in all our population models. And I think it's the biggest challenge we have is immigration and emigration is a real thing in the prairies, right? Mm-hmm. And we have connected breeding populations. We know, and let's be honest with everybody. We've been really bloody dry in Prairie Canada here for the last number of years. And production's it has to have been pretty crappy, right?
Yep.
Southwestern Manitoba's been better than Alberta and Saskatchewan, but I was up in southern Alberta last September, and it was awful. And I flew into Calgary here 2 weeks ago for some business, and I was pretty delighted to see it be green, because it hadn't been green in a long time. And I get lots of calls from hopeful duck hunters that every time it looks like it's going to rain over North Dakota or Saskatchewan, they're like, is the drought over? And I said, how long does it take you to fill your Green Tree Reservoir in Stuttgart? 14,000 gallons per minute. And it doesn't, the water isn't standing in 4 minutes, right? So
right.
We've got a lot of work to do to break the drought in Prairie Canada. I'm hopeful that you're right. Hopefully this is the start of it. Again, it'd be interesting. We saw what the Game and Fish saw with their survey. It'll be interesting to see what the feds say. But I think there were still big parts of the landscape that probably weren't that attractive, especially prairie nesting ducks. And so the challenge is you can make a lot of ducks in landscapes where you get the right environmental conditions, I think, like we've had here in South Dakota. But I think we just started probably with a much smaller breeding population than we have in a long time.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I teach in my waterfowl ecology and management class that, like, rain can be fine for ducklings if it's not cold rain and it's not at the wrong time, right? But if you get warm rains, if you look at the numbers, like, you can get tons of rain late, and then all of a sudden, like, duckling survival is really high, it's a nice warm rain, and it's not like a cold rain when they're downy, because hypothermia is a real thing for ducklings and goslings and cygnets, which are baby swans, if people aren't familiar with that. All that stuff is super detrimental. It's the same thing for turkeys and grouse and other stuff too, right? So what I've been watching is like, what are the temperatures? What are the rains like? And even if they're torrential, I think what's happening though is now I'm seeing this like really dry stretch, and it looks like we're at the perfect point where the timing is almost exactly right, where the water's there and we're getting all a lot of hatching that's happening. Or, I mean, that's my sense. Is that where you're at with it? Like,
yeah,
the timing seems perfect.
I mean, we're seeing, I think the ducks that settled here got to work pretty early. And of course we could, because we didn't have any snow to deal with. We didn't, we had ice, but I think a lot of mallards and pintails got started here pretty early, and we're seeing the first early broods right now. And so, yeah, I mean, we keep sustaining that season. The seasonal wetland resource is really the one that drives the re-nesting behavior and the duckling survival, and keep water in the bottoms of those seasonals and have all that emergent veg. We could have, dynamite duckling survival.
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm looking forward to for sure. So let's dive into kind of policies in Canada that, affect wetland conservation that you've been involved with in Manitoba and beyond. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there was a few years back, it was like the first year that the U.S. prairies actually produced more ducks than the Canadian prairies. What year was that, John, that happened?
I don't know.
I
think we started seeing it in the late 1990s. We saw it there in the 2000s. And then, you look at that shift, and I don't know about, I think I'm pretty confident per capita. I don't know if I'm as confident, just because the Canadian prairies are so much bigger.
Mm-hmm.
But, you had years where you had more breeding pintails in the U.S. prairies than you had in the Canadian prairies, which had you suggested that, 50 years ago, Johnny Lynch would have kicked you out of the bar, right?
Right.
So, I mean, we've seen this seismic shift. We've seen things like lesser scaup. The only landscape that lesser scaup were increasing in was in the Eastern Dakotas. And, lesser scaup were benefiting from CRP the same way gadwalls and shovelers were. It was remarkable, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, you've seen this feedback mechanism, and I know you and Julia talked about it in her segment, but Title II of the Farm Bill has been incredibly important in sustaining what the U.S. prairies looks like in terms of duck production, and it's a profound biological signal that we can all see, right? Now, you go over, you flip over the 49th parallel. And listen, I don't want anybody to walk away from this conversation thinking we're not losing small wetlands and cropland in the U.S. prairies, because, we're going to get we got the most recent update from the Status and Trends report from the Fish and Wildlife Service. We lost 673,000 acres, I think, of vegetated wetlands, with a big sort of big red blob in the U.S. prairie. So we're continuing to lose that resource here. But in Prairie Canada, Mike, the loss of small, shallow wetlands and cropland is at 0.88% a year.
Wow.
Giving presentations and talking about this. And listen, if your financial advisor was returning you 0.88% a year, you'd fire him or her pretty quickly. It doesn't seem like a lot.
No, but just think about, like, do the math on that. Like, it's not 1%. So it's not over 50 years you're going to lose 50% of that wetland type, right?
Right.
But it's pretty substantial.
1% than it is to 0%.
Exactly. Right? It's pretty rough. Yeah.
And you think of the historic rate of wetland loss in the Canadian prairies, it's been profound. And then you amplify that and say, let's say you and I continue to do, make better lifestyle choices. We live for 30 years. At that rate, we're going to have 25% fewer wetlands than we do today.
Yeah.
And that's frankly, we just can't live in a world like that if we want to have big fall flights of ducks. And, we've had a lot of duck hunters very concerned about the decline of mallard and pintail populations against the backdrop of this most recent drought. Well, what if that drought is permanent? Because that's what happens when you lose that small wetland base, is you force permanent drought on the landscape.
Yeah, because you during those low water years, you've put in infrastructure that doesn't allow those basins to hold water at all, right?
Yeah. And so the carrying capacity of the landscape just shrinks and shrinks and shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. And I mean, Dr. Frank Rohr and I argue a lot about what the cause of the decline of the pintail is. Frank, goes to the Richkus et al. Paper about pintails nesting in stubble. But I mean, you think about the loss of the temporary seasonal wetland resource and ephemeral wetland resource that we've had in places like southern Alberta and southern Saskatchewan. It's got the reduction in carrying capacity just has a profound impact on what these populations can do. And, even when Mother Nature may provide, moisture like she has here this spring, if there's no basin to catch water, it's of very little value to a breeding duck.
Yeah, so dig into what you guys have done then in Manitoba, because Canadian policy, I think I could also go with lack thereof for wetland conservation. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but you guys have been really influential in trying to come up with something that is a little more, I guess, proactive to keep some of those wetlands on the landscape. So why don't you fire away at that one, John?
Yeah, it's interesting, Mike. The big difference in Canada is agriculture is a shared provincial federal responsibility. The nice thing about working in the US is you get the Farm Bill right, you look pretty good coming at the end of the day, right?
Yep.
And Julie, I'm sure, talked to you about, Swamp Buster and EQIP and all the rest of the programs that are central to Title II of the Farm Bill. In Canada, there's been fits and starts around wetland regulations, but it's been hard to enforce, maybe not the will to enforce it in lots and lots of places, which is translated into that high wetland loss rate, especially those small, shallow wetlands and cropland. In the Manitoba government at the time, this was during the Pallister government here going back 5, 6, 7 years ago, did something that was pretty profound. Is they created a new wetland policy that would prohibit the drainage of class 5 wetlands and 4 wetlands, would allow for some drainage of type 3s with mitigation. And so, in terms of wetland policy in Prairie Canada, probably amongst the best. But what the concern we had with that is, and that was the deal that could be done, right? When you think about all the stakeholders to the government, you've got lots of farmers, you got rural communities, you've got all sorts of interests around the table. That was the deal they could do.
Right. Right.
What we thought was really important, though, is the way that regulation was structured. We thought, well, holy cow, what that means is there's no protection in maybe a big red circle around those remaining type 1 and 2 wetlands.
Can you just jump on what a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is in general?
Yeah,
so I think 1, 2s are really ephemeral.
Yeah,
and we
ones
go
are
up.
really ephemeral.
Right.
Ones are super ephemeral, may only be on the landscape a week or two. Really important for females returning to the nesting grounds. First things to thaw. Also, when on good soils full of all sorts of little grubbies and buggies that females need that protein to make eggs. Then you go to temporaries that will be on the landscape generally for a few weeks. Again, typically on the front end of that breeding season, really important part of the pair settling as pairs are settling on the landscape. In wet years, those temporaries will be sustained, through the nesting season. Then you go to seasonals, where a little longer duration of inundation.
Are we at 4s now, John? Is that like a 4?
We're 3s.
We're still at 3. Okay.
3s.
Yep.
Seasonals are 3s. Typically, a little more robust vegetation component to 3s. They will persist generally through the nesting season. at least with hydrology in part of the basin. When it's crazy wet, they'll be bank full all the way through the nesting season. Really important for duckling survival. That's the best brood habitat we have on the prairies, but also really important for territorial spacing. Then you go to fours, which are the semi-permanents. Those are wetlands that everybody knows as wetlands, which are cattails, the kind of places redheads, canvasbacks will nest. And then you go to the class 5, which are the more permanent types, which are
kind of like more open lake type stuff,
more
like
open
Scop, Gadwall type places, if anything, right?
Exactly.
So Frank Baldwin was talking with us, and he said it got so dry last fall that their 5s were disappearing.
Yep.
Like that seems incomprehensible to me for somebody that was on the prairies in 1998.
Yeah,
right?
and I would say it was very common. In Manitoba was probably in better shape than almost anywhere in the Canadian prairies. There were lots. I drove by a DU project in southern Alberta that I've driven by for years, probably a half-mile wide, couple 3 miles long, big staging marsh. There wasn't a drop of water in it. So
crazy.
even those permanent basins in really severe drought, like we've had in Alberta and Saskatchewan and parts of Manitoba, went dry last fall.
So I did interrupt you, and I apologize. And if you did, I lost your train of thought for you. But wherever you were on policy differences and where we're at in Manitoba, just
so the Manitoba government enacts this new wetland regulation, and we said, well, that's wonderful, but here's the deal. We've got a bit of an orphan group of wetlands here, being the types 1s and 2s.
Yeah.
We worked with the Manitoba government, and Mike, this was actually announced the first day of the Duck Symposium in Winnipeg. I actually bailed out of the Duck Symposium and drove up to Okamic, where DU Canada's headquarters are, and Premier Pallister made an announcement that they were going to create a new voluntary incentive-based tool, conserve 90% of the province's remaining type 1 and 2 wetlands.
Wow.
The really cool thing about that was he basically read off of our presentation.
Nice.
And so basically the work that, and I can't take credit for it, it's Jim Fisher's work. Jim had worked really hard with the government, and they basically adopted the program that we were hoping to establish, just like that. And the really cool thing about what Manitoba did was they established a trust fund to pay for it in perpetuity. And so it isn't subject to what you and Julia were talking about, is how many acres of CRP, how many dollars are we going to have for EQIP or RCPP or WRE, like we have in the Farm Bill fight every 5 years here. Those dollars are locked away outside of government, with the annual draw then being used to pay farmers.
And so it's like an investment so that it keeps up with the market in general.
Exactly.
And then can actually, so like in Farm Bill, for instance, like when corn goes like something insane, like $8 a bushel, there's no way you can incentivize farmers to not farm marginal land, because the risk is worth it to see if you can get a crop off of that.
Right.
Where in this case, you've got money sitting in a market that keeps up with what's going on economically and can actually match a little better, at least, right? It can keep up with that. So that's cool.
Yeah. But the other thing is, it's not subject to the changing whims of government, right? Because we've seen it happen from time to time where good policy comes, but the next people get elected, different set of circumstances become priorities, and those old priorities go away. This way, it's part of the programming in Manitoba forever.
Yeah, it's not political whims either, right?
Yeah, exactly. So,
exactly.
The government that started that was a conservative government, toward progressive conservative government. The current government in Manitoba is NDP government, a little left of center, but the program is durable. It will be there forever and ever and ever.
That's good. So what do you feel like the returns have been on that so far? Is it gaining speed? Is it slow to start? Is it like taking off like a rocket? Where is it?
It's going really well, Mike, because I think it all goes back to the simple statement we've heard farmers make about these small wetlands for years, is if they're so damn valuable, pay us for them, right? Mm-hmm. And there's lots of ways we can pay for them. We can pay for them through Fish and Wildlife Service easements. We do a lot of that in the U.S. prairies. You can do easements in Canada too. But a lot of farmers are really like, sort of voluntary incentive-based term programs. And the cool thing about this program that I think makes it so attractive to ag producers and private landowners is it doesn't force them to take it out of production. They can continue to farm those basins when it's dry, just like you can with the Fish and Wildlife Service easement here in the Dakotas. And so it works well within their operations. And you're basically then providing compensation for the opportunity cost that those wetlands represent when they're wet. Or when they're damp take a year like this year. I'm sure there were a bunch of farmers that seeded a bunch of that stuff this spring, that all those inputs have now been lost to those rains, right? And that's, if you're a farmer, those aren't insignificant costs. So what we're doing is providing a real market signal to those farmers that, essentially to compensate for that opportunity cost. And then, what we see happen is we see farmers respond really well to that. What we've seen happen here in North Dakota, what we've seen happen across the U.S. prairies, and what we've seen happen in Manitoba is, well, geez, somebody's willing to pay me for these. That's something that works within my operation. It's been really, really widely accepted in farm communities.
Yeah, and Julie and I talked about this too when we talk Farm Bill. This is bottom up stuff that incentivizes, and you have to think like a farmer and what makes sense for them, right?
Right.
Yeah,
that's
right. Really what it has to be, because this top down. I mean, I get sick of top down stuff, right? As a New York resident, and right. For all the great outdoors things New York has, it is still New York, and so right. I feel the pain and have throughout my life of top down type stuff, and it doesn't work long term, right? Some people might think it works short term, fine, but I don't ever think it really works. The bottom up stuff that is carrot and incentivizes in a proper manner that's of mutual benefit is where it's at.
Yeah, and if you think about it, 90% of that wetland resource we care about in the prairie pothole region sitting on private lands, right? Mm-hmm. It's not all owned by Ducks Unlimited and the Fish and Wildlife Service. It's not a vast wildlife refuge, right? It's overwhelming majority of that is sitting on private working farm and ranch ground. So we got to come up with tools that work for those folks if we want to deal with habitat at big scales. All
right. So Manitoba is crunching away and working. What else do you have? Do you have other Canada's big place, Saskatchewan, Alberta? Those are the places that have been really dry, where we've lost duck production to a greater degree, I think, right? Especially pintails.
Yeah.
How is this transitioning? Are people seeing the light elsewhere provincially?
Yeah.
What's on the horizon?
I mean, we've been spending a lot of time, and again, more Jim than me, but Jim and our partners in Alberta, I think if this is starting to become part of the working lexicon of the Alberta government right now. And again, you talked about top down. There's this, the Canadian federal government's being run right now. There was just a big announcement here, a week and a half ago, about this 30 by 30 push and protected areas and all the rest of that stuff. And the Alberta government spun around immediately and said, now, wait a second. You don't have jurisdiction to tell us how we're going to manage our lands in Alberta. Mm-hmm. Or across the other provinces, but we think we have a better model. Right?
So 30 by 30 is like 30% of the area protected by 2030?
Yes,
okay.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah, good.
And that's, in the Canadian context, that's been mainly talking about protected areas in the boreal.
Which it's already inaccessible anyway, right?
Well,
So,
yeah. I mean, I
it's
guess you can
basically
make an
kind of
argument.
protected to begin
Are we,
with. So
what are we conserving it? What are we conserving it from and for? But
right.
notwithstanding, but the Alberta government, and I think large parts of the work Jim and our folks have done out there is they spun around with this message that the Manitoba government used, which is, listen, we can be good stewards of our lands in a working land landscape, working in partnership through incentive-based policy with farmers. And we can do that in rural communities and keep these landscapes working while providing all the same objectives that you would have in a 30 by 30 policy. And what we've been pointing out to the Alberta government is, as you know, Mike, and many of your listeners would, Alberta is a huge oil and gas economy, right? They produce a ton of oil and gas. And so there's a lot of pressure both from within Alberta and from across Canada about, carbon sequestration and the rest of those things. Well, I mean, the argument you and your listeners would be amazed to know this, but not there. When you're in the halls of government, you don't find that many duck hunters. You don't find that many guys with decoys on their, decoys in their bookcase and pictures of dead ducks on their desk and black Labrador hair on their clothes. So, but the argument we're making in Alberta is, here's a way where you can conserve wetlands. You can work with farmers through incentive-based policies. You can do great stuff for pintails and mallards and gadwall and shovelers. But you can also do great stuff for carbon sequestration. 1 acre of prairie wetlands is storing 25.87 tons of carbon. You reduce the flood risk. 1 acre of wetlands stores 0.75 acre feet of water annually. You're doing great things for water quality, which is a concern all across the Canadian prairies by removing nitrogen and phosphorus. And you can do all that and continue to allow these lands to be worked as long as you preserve the integrity of those basins. I'm very hopeful that we're going to start to see policy come out of the Alberta government that is going to be targeted in the same way Manitoba was. Alberta, we're going to go 1, 2s, and 3s just because of the regulatory regime in Alberta being a little different than Manitoba. And we're very hopeful that we can get that program stood up here in short order, because the government is clearly hearing the argument and starting to internalize it.
So I just want to say, when you look at the landscape for ducks, if you look at Manitoba, Alberta prairie, I don't know what percentage it is of the prairie pothole region, but it's substantial. And so getting this stuff stood up and operational in both of those places and keeping what I really like is, hey, when these things go dry, go ahead and farm them.
Right.
But don't put in infrastructure when they're dry so that when it gets wet again, they can't hold water. That's the simple point. Because when people talk about a mallard population that has declined by 50% in very short order, it's funny. You think about mallards like a big duck, right, relative to all these other small ducks, but they really, really focus on and really need those ephemeral wetlands even more than a gadwall, more than a widgeon, more than some of these other, green-winged teal. I mean, a lot of these other species seemingly take advantage of these different types of basins. They all do really well in these class 1, class 2s, right? These really ephemeral type systems. But mallard boom and bust seems to really run heavily on those. So if you want mallards, these are the places. That
resource intact.
These are the places that matter. Yeah. Good stuff, John. Hey, we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about the new draw system in Manitoba for non-residents and the 3 pintail limit. So hang with us, folks. Look, folks, the Farmland Group across the Mid-South is your one-stop shop for real estate brokerage, consulting, management, lending, and appraisals. If you own land or you want land, the Farmland Group is where it's at. With over $500 million in farm sales and growing, Gwynn and Shelby Smith have you covered. Look, if you're thinking about buying or selling, contact the Farmland Group to access their full suite of services. If you already own property and want to build equity and value, the Farmland Group gets it done. If you're looking to purchase a new property, well, they get that done too, and they have access to some of the best lending available. Looking to sell? Get it appraised with a Farmland Group affiliated appraiser. But let's be clear for our listenership too. They also offer farm and hunt property management to create places that attract more ducks and more bucks. Who doesn't want that? More ducks and more bucks. Let the Farmland Group build value into your property. Find them today at farmlg.com. That's farmlg.com. You're not going to be disappointed. Contact Shelby Smith today at farmlg.com and let him know that the Foul Weather Podcast sent you their way. All right, and we're back with John Devney of Delta Waterfowl, and we're going to talk a little bit about, all right, let's stay out of the politics maybe. Can a policy guy stay out of the politics?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just the Manitoba draw system for non-residents, like sense of how it's working. It's kind of in its infancy, and Delta had some comments on it on the front end. But what's your sense of, where we're at with that? We did cover it with Frank Baldwin, and he basically said, time will tell where it's going. But what are your thoughts, John?
Yeah, I think just a couple thoughts. I think we haven't really seen it work yet, Mike, from last year, because last year was kind of a bridge year. As an example, guides and outfitters in the midst of this transition could take clients that drew through the freelance draw pool. Mm-hmm. That won't be the case this year. So basically, guides and outfitters will have an allocation of licenses based on 3 years pre-COVID. Those are the clients they can take. I think, we heard a lot of concerns, especially as things I think were were poorly reported in the early days of this. But I think, last year was 100% draw rate for freelance Americans that want to go up. I think it's going to be awful close to that again this year. The big difference is, and it frankly, it impacts a guy like me, Mike. I mean, I can be at Whitewater Lake, which is a great Canadian staging marsh, just right across the border. One of my very favorite places to hunt. I get 7 days there, right, as an American. And so, I would love to be able to spend more time up there than that.
Yeah, because you could just jump back and forth, right?
Because I'm in a position to jump back and forth. But, if you look at the non-resident statistics in Manitoba, Alberta, place like North Dakota, the overwhelming number of folks, like greater than 90%, are hunting for 7 days or less anyways.
Right.
And what it does is, I think the hope is that in addition to managing, guiding, and outfitting, which I think we'll start to see happen here in the 25 hunting season, it will stop the emergence of new clubs happening in Manitoba. And the interesting thing about Manitoba is a lot of those old historic legacy clubs were big marsh diving duck places. But what's happened in the last 20 years with the emergence of everybody loving shooting ducks without owning a pair of chest waders, the competition over those really good grain fields, and especially in southwestern Manitoba, has become pretty acute. And you've had American groups coming up and buying up properties and then subsequently tying up big acreages. And I think it'll mitigate that, any more of that happening, right? So I'd love to say that this will be the last time we see it. I don't think that's true. I mean, you look at what's happening and being proposed in Kansas. You look at what's happening at WMAs in Arkansas. How do you manage this resource in a way that, benefits, shows primacy of residency, but then allows the average everyday Joe freelance hunter an opportunity? And I think I think that's going to be a conversation we're going to have a lot more over the next, I think through the end of my career, frankly.
Yeah, not just Manitoba, obviously, but just
Right.
lots of places. Like, I mean, access is this major issue, and overcrowding seems to continue to be an issue, and as private land gets gobbled up with leases and other things. And I mean, it's part of the free capital system. I'm not against it. It's just like, how do we balance it so that we can continue to have quality experiences for those folks, you know, blue collar Joe coming off the street that wants to duck hunt and is very often just crammed onto, you know, overcrowded public land. So it's a struggle. Yeah.
Overcrowded in a lot of instances with failing infrastructure, reduced manpower, meaning reduced management, poor quality habitat. I mean, that's the trend we're seeing across our public trust resources is less management, worn out infrastructure, lack of investment, and which means the experience for the average duck hunter in a lot of these places is not what it was 20 years ago. And we need those resources more than we ever have, both for the ducks and for duck hunters. And I think in far too many instances, it's failing. It's not living up to its objective.
Yeah, I agree. And we're going to jump on a little bit of management stuff here in a little bit. But my gosh, I've been chomping at the bit to talk pintails with you a little bit, John. So you guys were pretty instrumental through your science in helping kind of move forward. And, you know, tell me if I'm wrong anywhere here. This is my interpretation of it. But Delta was involved with the science around the pintail harvest model, and in that discussion heavily, and how the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service kind of approaches harvest strategies. So, you know, to the extent that guns don't drive duck populations, but ducks drive how much guns go off, can we talk about... I just like to put that one in there. Like, that's my favorite thing is that term. It doesn't always work, right? But I think this is hot on the minds of a lot of folks with the potential for a 3 pintail limit. Not this year. I want to clarify for listeners, not this year, 25, 26. But, you know, we have to also...
I'd be pretty skeptical for 25, 26 too.
Well...
in the 3 Western prairies.
Exactly. But, you know, we're sitting in the Atlantic Flyway where we've where it looks like, I think we're shooting less than, what's the percentage? Less than 5% of pintails?
Pretty teeny tiny.
Across the continent. I mean, you can get into them in certain places for sure. So it's really going to increase people's opportunity in some places in the Atlantic Flyway. So Atlantic Flyway is standardized at a 3 pintail limit, which is cool because, you know, we've seen, and you've seen this, John, we've seen a lot of things taken away in the Atlantic Flyway.
Right.
Gob, Canada geese, mallards. I don't want to get into that. We'll talk about that another time. But so we're back at 4 at least with mallards. Sea ducks. A lot of these things that the Atlantic Flyway has pulled back. And I'm a little critical of it because I think some of it's reaction, a little too knee-jerk, a little too reactionary, but at least we're at this 3 pintail thing. So it's like at least, you know, pitching us a bone for something. But the 3 pintail limit, so people are clear, is not guaranteed in the Mississippi Central and Pacific Flyways. So there's certain triggers for that which would make that happen. But do you want to speak a little bit to kind of Delta's involvement in that pintail process? And then you said you're skeptical of the 3 bird limit, but where do you feel like we're headed?
Well, let's start with the skepticism. I mean, and then we'll get into the technical elements. I mean, I just don't imagine a world where we're going to have a big pintail population this breeding season, which will be used to inform the 25-26 season, right? It's too damn dry. You know, if the Eastern Dakotas, which have been, you know, sort of the Garden of Eden for prairie ducks the last few years, if we didn't have them here, the North Dakota Game and Fish Survey, at least based on their methodology, didn't find the pintails. I can't imagine there's a huge reservoir of pintails in Alberta and Saskatchewan as dry as it was. So that's why I'm skeptical. I'm not skeptical because of the models. I'm not skeptical by anything else. I just don't think we're going to see a big, robust pintail population that I have to imagine is what triggers a 2 or 3 bird limit. So that's the reason for my skepticism. I think Delta's Delta's role in this, and as you well know, Mike, the process is pretty closed when it comes to these regulations, right? And maybe that's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing. That's a 2-hour argument we could have over a different set of circumstances. But the people that deserve the credit of getting us here, I think, are the flyways and the feds. Yeah, I mean, we've been pushing, CWA's been pushing, I know DU wrote letters. We wanted them to update the model because we think there were some assumptions in that model that were just didn't pass, sort of the duck biology 101 sort of sense. And one of our big concerns about it was, the old model seemed to assume we could get to a pintail population of 5.4 million. And frankly, I just don't think there's the carrying capacity for pintails out there to get to 5.4 million. You look at the contemporary high water mark for pintails in the last 20 years, I think it's been around 4.4, 4.5. And so assuming you can get to 5.4 and assuming additivity, that forces your regulations down a fairly narrow pipe, right?
Certainly.
And so there are things, and you're right, we did some really good science, primarily with the folks out in Reno, sort of looking at pintail populations and looking at a variety of factors. But, and I'm glad we did that. And, perhaps, we certainly shared that information far and wide. And I'm hopeful that, that research spurred along some of these conversations, but the real accolades need to go to the service and the flyways. Although I'll say it took the service took this a lot longer than I think it should have, but they're the folks that made the work happen. If we played a role in informing it and advocating for change, I'm glad we did, but those are the folks that did the hard work.
Well, and I think that's a really important point, John, and there's lots of times that, and you know this, and I don't hide it, that I'm at odds with the Atlantic Flyway folks. And we're like, hey, you guys maybe should be doing this stuff. And they're like, well, we're okay. Our process is working and so on and so forth. And then I'm like, no, we're going to do some science. We're going to push some mallard stuff out the door.
Yep.
Right now I'm doing this is a sidebar, it's out of the waterfowl world, but turkey populations are declining in lots of places. And so we're going down a road kind of independent of what other people are doing. But what I would say is we're checking off a box, right? Like in the large scheme of things of like what could be going on, what's happening, what's driving these populations, what types of metrics go into decision making. We're at least checking a box. We're doing some science. We're training students that then go work for Delta, DU, state agencies. So we're doing that academic thing. But we're also kind of what I feel like Delta does is says, hey, we're going to do some stuff with pintails, or we're going to help support this, or we're going to help support that. And it's like, it's a nudge, right? It's like, hey, we might want to be working on this thing because It's important to duck hunters, right? Like the turkey thing, like it's important to turkey hunters. Like you should probably not take, 10 years from when everybody starts to notice turkey populations are declining till you boot up and do something about it, right? So I like the nudge idea because it takes a community of conservationists to get this stuff done.
Right.
And I have no animosity against any of these folks, no matter how they feel about me sometimes. But it's like that, like we all have some ideas and some of them are better than others, but like, let's all just move it in a forward progression towards something positive for the resource and for the hunters. And sometimes it takes a nudge from a group like Delta to say, hey, let's get after it.
Well, and I think the thing about it is the Fish and Wildlife Service has a legal treaty authority, right? Mm-hmm. And they're risk averse. Let's be honest, they're risk averse. And in the States, especially because of their close proximity to the feds through the flyways, they have a set of realities that they're living within, right?
Yep.
And then there's folks like me that have a different set of realities that we're living in, right? And when I'm hearing from duck hunters and when I'm observing things and when I'm seeing things, I'm not saying that we should be judge, jury, and executioner because, we don't have a legal responsibility to manage. Yeah, we represent duck hunters and nobody else. And so we have our own biases. But I think in the world of ideas, it's a good tension, right? And as long as the tension, the service's tension towards not being wanting to be sued by somebody doesn't override the tension of duck hunters wanting to be managing to the best available science and finding the sweet spot between that, I think it's a healthy place. I don't want to be around when we kill the last duck, right? I don't think we're going to do that, Mike, to your earlier point, but that's not a desired state. But I'm also pissed off about bluebill regulations.
Ridiculous. Ridiculous. It's crushed me. I literally, like when I sold my boat to my neighbors as a fishing boat, I just threw all my diving duck decoys in it.
Right.
I'm out. It's just so much work around here. They get here in like December, January. And you're aware, I spent 2 winters on Lake Ontario from December to March shooting 750 ducks for my PhD work.
Right.
In a survival suit in a canoe on Lake Ontario. Right. I've seen ice. I've seen cold. I'm done with it. Right. So that's some of it. But a lot of it was like the regulations just weren't in a spot that was made it worth for me to do it when I could just really focus heavily on being a marsh hunter. And so I feel like it took that opportunity away from me. And I've been very bitter about bluebill regulations and all the science from academia that has come out that says it's not harvest. It's not harvest. And my goodness, thank goodness we got there with pintails though, right? Like maybe we can move the needle in the future
on Scott.
But let's talk about this then. So there must be people out there like, well, the pintail population dropped and it never increased. So how can we now increase the limit when we don't have a quote unquote robust population that is recovered?
Well, I think, again, populations are where populations are when the last data point you looked at, right? Pintail populations were pretty darn healthy. One of the healthier populations we had, not relative to their long term, but in terms of just raw numbers of ducks, 2010, 2011, 2012, and 2013, we had a hell of a lot of pintails around. You know why? Because the prairies were wet and they were having great recruitment. Yeah, the pintail population's in the tank, but we've had Alberta and Saskatchewan essentially off the production grid for some number of years here. And so, I was a little startled, again, just not having the experience in the Atlantic Flyway, to see black ducks go from 2 to 1 with black duck populations didn't increase to get us to 2 black ducks. That was a scientific exercise where we recognized we projected black duck harvest based on assumptions on mallard survival in harvest data. And we figured out we don't shoot black ducks the same way we shoot mallards. And so there's more allowable take. So I think the pintail experiment's very similar to that. And yeah, I agree with you, Mike. As a guy that grew up, my father loved nothing more than shooting bluebills over big water. And I've got more 72 herders, armor-coated decoys, and other black and white decoys in my shop that rarely come out anymore because, frankly, I got to drive by too damn much good puddle duck hunting to go shoot one bluebill for all the work it's going to take.
Yeah. If I could go out with like 3 guys and set up a layout with 3 guys and run a layout and shoot 6 birds each and, have big flocks, 50, 100 bluebills ripping by you. My goodness, it's awesome. But to sit up and smack 2 of them and go home.
Right.
It's a whole nother beast,
Or 1 in North Dakota.
Oh goodness, I don't even want to talk about it. You're giving me heartburn.
So no, I think I appreciate the good technical work. I appreciate the advocacy that the community brought to bear on it. And, we got to see what the model ultimately says though, right? Because basically what the Service Regs Committee said is we're going to allow a 3-bird option. It's a policy, that's a policy decision, not a technical question. And then what do those models ultimately look like? How many pintails do we need to have to have a 3-bird limit? I don't know the answer to that. I don't think anybody does yet.
I don't either. And John, I mean, I'm kind of a jack of all trades. There's a lot of things I do in the waterfowl world, but I would not call myself a population ecologist, right? The folks that the Sedingers of the world, the Coons of the world, the Alisoscus, the Todd Arnolds. If I miss somebody, I apologize, but I'm not, I follow it, but I have that whole pintail model and everything in my inbox, and I've scanned through it, but till the numbers come in, I think over a few years we'll know what it's going to tell us, right? Yep. So, but what I like is that we've been following the science in general. I'm going to wrap this up on kind of harvest stuff here, but in general, we've been following the science that pretty much shows that shooting ducks is not running these populations to a large degree. It's all these other outside things, and we can't typically you can't stockpile ducks. I mean, Johnny Lynch said it years ago. You can't stockpile them. You can't send them back to nothing, right? So might as well, I guess the term too is shoot them while you got them.
Well, the only thing I'll say to that, Mike, is, we're hearing a lot of concern. You go from 10.5 million mallards to where we are today in the mid-continent.
Yeah.
And I think people are shook.
I agree. I am. I mean, yeah, I am taking this side, right? So people are aware, like when I go back and forth with folks on this stuff, I think the easy thing is to say, we better stop shooting ducks because, oh my goodness,
right?
That's the way you save them. Because it just makes sense, right? There is some logic in that. But the reality is, in the science, it doesn't seem to go that way, right? So there's a lot of folks that are jumping on, like, we just need to be conservative. And my sense is that, like, I called this, it's the same thing I said to Frank Baldwin, the last episode, is I kind of want to shoot what I call shoot them through the bottom. Because we've never done it. We've always gotten afraid. We've always gotten afraid. And we've always been like, 45 days. 3 birds. But now we have science that says maybe we don't need to do that. So why take it away, right?
No, I agree. I think there's some interesting conversations coming from people I respect and trust that are saying, what about the second hen mallard? And it's that kind of conversation. I don't think anybody's talking about, we're not going to get away from the AHM models, but what are the little things? Mm-hmm. I mean, I think, that's where Delta's voluntary restraint program 1 million years ago, a program we haven't talked about in a long time, that's where it started, was how do we keep hunters hunting against a backdrop of, sort of downturns in populations and concerns. And
right.
And so I think while I think the science is very clear, and I think we're one wet year on the prairies from these problems going away, I'm not perhaps as quick to dismiss the view of hunters saying, well, what could we do here, right? Because ultimately, and duck hunters are great about, have an incredible tradition of this. Who else taxes themselves like duck hunters do?
Right.
And duck hunters have shown an incredible appreciation for this resource. And so I think we get so sciencey that we can sort of not necessarily listen to those things. I think we should we should think about and listen to what people are saying, not going saying we're going to bail out of AHM because we got afraid, but what are the things that we could do along the margins that might make sense? I look at California mallards and go, how the hell are we shooting these things for 107 days and 7 mallards a day when that population's been in the crapper for 10 years?
Right. And they just stay at about where they're at, and they're just shooting them, and
no change. But I mean, talk about a place that's losing carrying capacity and reproductive potential. Central Valley mallards are numero uno in the North American continent for suffering that fate.
Well, let's hit on a couple things here, though. Like, one, who's actively shooting hen mallards anyway? Right?
That's the great question.
I don't know if you went to 1 from 2.
What do you?
I mean, most days, if I've got a good day, I mean, it's rare I come out with 2. Anyway, right? I don't think most people are like just smacking the first thing. I mean, maybe it happens, right? Maybe folks are just shooting what they can shoot, right? But most duck hunters want to come home. If I can come home with 4 greenheads, that's what I'm doing.
Yeah, no, and I think I just got my letter back from turning the wing bee. I know exactly how many hen mallards I shot this year. It's that many.
None.
It's 0.
None. None.
But I also live in North Dakota, and I also hunt exclusively on public lands, and I also shot a crap ton of ducks in my life, and I don't need to shoot a hen. I'm in a different position than a lot of duck hunters are. I don't know if I need to tell the guy. I don't need to wag my finger at a guy that shoots a couple hen mallards because that's what flies by as decoys in the morning.
No.
I'm interested in the conversation because I think it's coming from the right place, generally.
I do too. What I'm concerned about, John, is when we get so wrapped up in this type of conversation about harvest and whether it drives populations, when the reality is that we, as hunters, all have one thing in common, and that's that we need habitat to exist on the ground so those ducks exist. Exactly. So why don't we talk more about the Farm Bill and the things going on in Manitoba and Alberta? And that's why I had you on. That's why I had Frank Baldwin on to talk about a lot of habitat stuff. It's why I had Julie on about Farm Bill. These, I think, are the key conversations that we should be having, and people should think, not a political comment, but damn it, think about who you vote for and what they, how they interact with the Farm Bill, right? Yep. And conservation and things, because your effort, I think, like, if I had a conversation with somebody that was like, I think we're shooting way too many ducks, and instead we just talked about habitat, we'd agree on that. Right? Let's focus on those things. So that's kind of that's my second point. First point was, who the hell shoots hen mallards anyway? And the second one was the kumbaya thing of like, we have more in common than we think when we get into this stuff. So, hey, we've been talking a lot about breeding stuff. Super appreciate the time, and especially on everything you guys are doing with breeding ducks. But the wintering grounds also matter, right? Yep. And those migratory places. Duck populations tend to be highest when conditions are optimal on breeding, staging, or migration areas, and then wintering areas and sending them back. To what extent do you think active management on staging areas and wintering areas is important for sustaining duck populations, at the larger scale? I mean, it's maybe a loaded question. It seems obvious, but rather than just say, hey, all we have to do is preserve wetlands and ducks fly south and everything's fine.
Yeah, I don't think that's true. And I mean, I think it's especially not true when you look at how landscapes at least in the Mississippi and Central Flyway have changed. You've got lots of examples of it back east and out west too. But we've radically changed agriculture in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, right? Post-harvest flooding just isn't done the way it used to be done 20 years ago. And it's because agronomic performance has been proven to decline when those guys are flooding fields. So one of the things, and I don't know if Julia talked about it, but that we've been working with DU and TRCP on is this Migratory Bird Resurgence Initiative, which is asking NRCS to spend, a lot of money up here on the prairies to conserve small, ephemeral, temporary, and seasonal wetlands. But it's also got an ask in there to invest in 500,000 acres of post-harvest flooding in California, Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, those 5 states. It's just those 5. Because I think this change at a landscape scale has had radical implications for duck distribution. And I recognize, the new paper that just got released. I'll be honest, I've been very skeptical of cross-seasonal effects, but I live on the prairies, so color me a prairie Nazi. But what I worry about in wintering areas and staging areas is not so much about the ducks. I worry about the duck hunters. And I worry about what that distribution of ducks historically looked like in a place like Arkansas or Mississippi or Louisiana, what it looks like today. And I think there's two things. We got to address the habitat loss on private working agricultural lands, which has been significant and profound. But as I mentioned earlier, Mike, our public trust assets, whether we're talking about refuges or WMAs, are just not living up to the habitat objectives that we need them to. And that's especially important when the broader agricultural landscape's jacked up, right? I mean, you go to the coastal regions, Louisiana, you've lost rice in favor of sugarcane. You've lost an incredible amount of coastal marsh, and our refuges are in crappy shape. And our refuges aren't in crappy shape because the Fish and Wildlife Service wants our refuges in crappy shape. It's being in a region that's perpetually impacted by hurricanes, which is hard on infrastructure. And we have 750 less people in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service refuge program than we did in 2010. It's less people to disc fields. It's less people to move water. There's less infrastructure to manage water. And multiply that across national wildlife refuges across the country and state-owned assets. And our public trust assets just aren't contributing the way we need them to against this broader sea of backdrop of landscape change. And it's where hunters hunt.
It is. And John, I will throw another one in there. Apathy by the public servants that work on state areas and national wildlife refuges, and a lack of skill set, because in something that we're combating, it's not, and I don't want to throw people under the bus too much. It's just that what we tend to be producing from universities are students that aren't traditional hunters and fishermen. They're not hook and bullet.
Right.
And one of the things we're combating in my program is, and a lot of folks are now too, Doug Osborne's doing it, right? He's got really awesome tech degree that he's pumping out these students that know what a water control structure is, for that matter, right? Like, I think a lot of people come out of programs and they get jobs at national wildlife refuges somehow as wildlife biologists, and they walk up, I joke about this, I say they walk up to a water control structure, they look at it and they say nope, and they turn around.
Right.
Because they don't know what moist soil management is, right? And they haven't, like, there's some old school folks like myself. That's funny to say old school already. I'm not that old, but Kaminsky taught me, and Harold Prince taught Kaminsky, and so on and so forth. But those folks and those programs are less and less. There's less of those applied programs pumping out students so we got to reduce budget, we got to reduce workforce, and then those people that are actually there have diverse interests beyond waterfowl, right?
I think it's really contributing to it, though. But here's what I'm trying to do in my old age, because it's an attribute I've never had throughout my 50 years exchanging oxygen for carbon dioxide on this planet. I'm working really hard on empathy. And I think you look at a refuge manager and you look at what the staff complement is on our refuge system today, even if you had wildly optimistic and you were an old school duck manager, I think you'd figure out, I can't do it. I'm going to make sure the yard's mowed, right? Like, I think between failing infrastructure, lack of operational resources, and just sheer reduction in workforce, I think we've got a massive problem on our hands that we're not talking enough about. And listen, I'll take as much responsibility for that as anybody. We passed the Great American Outdoors Act. We passed the bipartisan infrastructure law. We've got the Inflation Reduction Act. And holy crap, is it becoming evident that we just don't have the human beings on the landscape to do this work. And And ultimately, if you want to have the kind of moist soil you and Mike Schumer and John Devney would like to see on refuges, it takes tractor passes, intensive water management, and those things take human beings. And if there's not human beings, we're going to get to the point where we're at. And I think that's really, yeah, I'm not going to disagree with you a minute about, the notion that a lot of folks go into wildlife. They didn't go into wildlife to pull a disc behind a tractor, right? They went into work on Monte Carlo simulations and a bunch of shit I don't understand. But I think we have a foundational problem, 1 or 2 levels below that is really hurting our public lands.
And yes, so I'm going to pull back from my comment a little bit, because just down the road from us at Montezuma, we have an amazing wildlife biologist that runs a multitude of impoundments and does an amazing job of running the emergent marsh cycle. And this woman doesn't come from a hunting background in general, right? But her son now hunts, and some of my friends that have actually been on the podcast, Matt Frackleton, on the Kitchen Conversation stuff, has taken her son out hunting, and he's gotten all into it. But the point here is that when I talk to her, I'm like, Linda, you're doing an amazing job out there. This is probably some of the best management I've seen, in New York State. But you can see that she just doesn't have the staff or the equipment to do it. There's one whole impoundment that needs a new water control structure and a berm and stuff like that, and they just can't get there, right? The DU helped purchase and then hand over a 300-acre marsh. It took them. It's going to be, I think, rotated into the hunt system, right? Which will be nice, but it's like 350 acres, and they put one dividing berm in it and maybe replaced a couple other water control structures. And I don't know, it's been like 8 years, yeah. Right? It's pretty crazy how hard it is to get this stuff done. And it's money and it's equipment and it's people is a large portion of it as well. So it's not just that people are apathetic, but just coming from the Atlantic Flyway, where the refuge system took away farming, and yep. The focus tends to be, took the refuge system and it moved it towards conserving endangered species and more of a conservation biology movement, despite that the refuge system was intentionally intended for waterfowl. I'm a bit sour, right? And some of that is students and the change in philosophy, and then who moved into those positions. So I don't think we're disagreeing. I think we're saying the same thing kind of side by side. So
yeah, and I think the thing about it is, and I think you're nudging against a thing that we've been really engaged in over some, suggested changes about how we manage refuges. And again, my members, you and I, bought those refuges,
right?
With my bird dollars. And Congress charters all those refuges for very specific purposes. And don't change management of a refuge without talking to people that bought it, is my very strong opinion on that.
Yeah, let's wrap it up there. I think that's an awesome point. So, John, you're kind of a important person, I think, in the waterfowl world. And, when it comes to sustaining healthy waterfowl populations through all the work you do with Delta, I mean, policy kind of has its fingers everywhere. So really thank you for everything that you're doing, and all the folks you work with, and all the kind of policy touches you have out there. But for the average duck hunter, if there was one thing you could say, hey, what can you do, right? What can you do to sustain those populations so you have these folks want quality duck hunting experiences. We can't deal with hey, it was a warm winter, right? That's stuff that happens. But yep. What can these folks do that is going to make their experience better?
Buy 2 duck stamps. Every single one of you, buy 2 duck stamps. Best investment you can make. And don't be afraid when you hear from Delta, DU, California Waterfowl Association, CSF on important policy issues. People pay attention to this stuff. Engage. When you hear there's an issue going on, reach out to your legislature. And we, DU, Delta, CWA, all of us have done our level best to make that easy for you. But take the time to fill out the form and send it to your lawmaker. I've seen so many times where a couple hundred human beings, I mean, Delta, when we started the youth hunting program, the Youth Waterfowl Days in Canada, we advocated strongly for it. There was a huge group of people that framed it as Ottawa wanting to arm children, and I swear to God, Mike, and this is long before we got good at it. We found a way to get 200 Canadian citizens to write into the Canadian Wildlife Service, and that saved Youth Waterfowl Day in Canada.
Yeah.
200 human beings. Now, we're going to all watch the elections in November, and there's hundreds of millions of, tens of millions of votes and all the rest of this stuff. And I'm not talking about that, but when stuff's happening in your community or you get an email from Delta or DU or whoever else, take the time and send the note in, because ultimately, whether you're Julia Peoples or John Devney or whomever working on these issues full time, we're only as good as the army we can amass of human beings that care about this stuff. And if we say it's a big deal and there's nobody standing behind us with sending letters and making phone calls to elected officials, we start looking, like a paper tiger. And so that would be my advice. Buy 2 duck stamps and engage with lawmakers when you can, when there's issues important to you as a duck hunter.
Yeah, and so advocate based on, the information that Delta's bringing forward with a positive voice, right? So there's because there's a negative angle to that too. You can come off looking a little hot-headed too. So
and you know what?
Every
now and then we're all entitled to that. Congressman Clyde, who introduced a piece of legislation to get rid of the Pittman-Robertson funding mechanism, figured that out, right?
Yeah.
And that's okay. Bad ideas should be punished and good ideas should be affirmed.
I like it.
Yeah.
I like it, John. Hey, we covered a lot of ground. I really appreciate you having here and really love what Delta does, but I've really latched on to this, focus on duck hunters.
Yep.
And still grounded in science, got the policy stuff that you guys do. So really thank you for all that you do for kind of all the great people, I guess duck people, I call them duck people across duck country. So keep doing what you're doing, John. And maybe if I'm lucky, I'll get up that way. We put in, my wife and I and a friend have put in for South Dakota.
Yep, as you should.
And we're going to see what happens there. Nobody else should ever apply because the deadline's July 7th and no one should apply so that we can get in, because I have not been back there to, I don't even know if I've been in South Dakota since I left in 1998, which is insane. I know. I drive through North Dakota all the time. My in-laws are in Montana. But thanks, John. Really appreciate your time. Take us out.
No, I didn't study it.
So it's may your skies be filled and shoot straight, my friends.
Okay, may your skies be filled and shoot straight, my friend.